My name is David Rabiner. I'm Associate Director for the Center for Child and Family Policy, and I'd like to welcome all of you here to this conference. I'd like to thank President Broadhead for his remarks and providing his perspective as a university president who deals with the issues that we'll be talking about over the next day and a half. Planning for this conference began last September, and it's really very exciting that the day has finally arrived. We're pleased to have a really very diverse group of professionals in the audience today. We've got a mix of researchers and academics who study the issues that we'll be talking about, clinicians who work in college campuses and elsewhere, who deal with the repercussions of what we'll be talking about, and then deans and student affairs professionals who are responsible for setting policy on their campus to address the issues that we'll be talking about. Over the next day and a half, our speakers will talk about a wide range of issues related to college student drinking and drug use, from basic research on how adolescent young adult brain development is affected by drinking and drug use. We'll hear about novel prevention and intervention programs that are going on campuses across the country. And then we'll hear some important policy discussions on sort of big picture ways to try to address the issue. If we don't fall too far behind schedule, which we already are well on our way to, we've tried to set this up so that following each speaker, there'll be 5 to 10 minutes for questions specifically pertaining to that speaker's talk. And at the end of each session, we've allowed more extended time for questions and discussion. We really have a very knowledgeable and experienced audience with us today who work in this area, and we really do encourage you during those times to share your questions and expertise with us. I want to just give a few housekeeping announcements before we start. The inevitable cell phones should be turned off or set to vibrate. The presentations today are being videotaped thanks to Rob DePauci of the Sanford School, and they'll be up on our website after the conference. Erica will send you all an email with a link to those presentations should you wish to revisit them. We'll be having lunch in the room right outside where we had breakfast, and you feel free to also eat at some of the pods around on the upper floors that you saw as you came in. We've got recycling bins out there, so take advantage of those. If you have any need for assistance during the day or tomorrow, there'll always be somebody out at the registration desk who can help you. And if you need a letter attesting to your attendance at the conference, just ask one of those people tomorrow and they can provide it for you. Some thank yous. First, I'd like to thank Ken Dodge, our center director, both for encouraging us to put this conference on and for providing the funding to make it possible. The administrative staff at the center, Barbara Pollack, Tammy Harbison, Shannon Smith, for taking care of many details related to today. Our speakers who've come from across the country to share their work and ideas with us over the next day and a half. A special thanks to Erica Lako, who's the Planning and Events Coordinator at the center and has taken care of 1,000 details that most of us would never even think to ask about. And now I'd like to also thank and to introduce Dr. Helene White, who's the co-organizer with me of this conference. Dr. White is a professor with a joint appointment in the Center for Alcohol Studies in the Sociology Department at Rutgers University. Her research focuses on the etiology, development, consequences, and comorbidity of substance use and other problem behaviors over the life course. She also develops and implements and evaluates brief intervention, substance use interventions for college students. Dr. White has published more than 150 articles and chapters. She served as a consultant for the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Institute of Justice, the National Science Foundation, and the Centers for Substance Abuse Prevention. When I first spoke with Ken about putting on a conference like this, I told him that since my own work has really only recently sort of veered into this field, that I would really need, as a co-organizer, somebody who was really had a broad perspective on the issues that we'll talk about, who was well connected with all the researchers that we'd want to bring into an event like this, and Ken suggested that, well, why don't you email Helene White? And I did, and she very graciously agreed to help out with this, and has really just been an extraordinary resource in putting this together. So I'll turn this over to Helene, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, David. It was about 9 months ago that David, Eric, and I started planning this conference, and today we give birth to it. And I can guarantee you it's going to be a great meeting. We've amassed an amazing group of researchers, clinicians, and policymakers to speak with you today. And so to get us on time, let me introduce our first speaker, which is Jason Kilmer, who will provide an overview of the issues of college student alcohol and drug use. Jason brings a very unique perspective to this topic because through most of his career, he's worn 2 hats. He's been a clinician on the front lines working with students with drug and alcohol problems, and he's also been a researcher designing and evaluating prevention programs for students. Currently, Jason is at the University of Washington, where he's a research assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. But he's also the Assistant Director of Health and Wellness for the Alcohol and Other Education within the Department of Student Affairs. And he and his colleagues at the University of Washington have been at the forefront of research on college student drinking and drug use and prevention. And it's my honor to introduce you, Jason Kilmer.
Thank you. Oh, it's okay. I'm okay, thanks. Good morning, everybody. It was pointed out to me on more than one occasion. It's actually 6 in the morning at home, which is great. And so I should start waking up right when my talk is done, which is not so great. Just before I click off this, what's not known about this picture is that there was a happy ending to this, actually. This picture was taken shortly before the speaker's dinner last night, and afterwards we were all like, we should do something. And we did. We met with these students. We had a brief intervention. We didn't have the opportunity to do a lot of follow-up, but at 3-hour follow-up, there was both reduced use in drinking and related consequences, and by 6-hour follow-up, they were playing Rock Band, which was viewed as don't stop believing. It was quite an accomplishment there. So let me switch over, and so I'm going to try and get us, I will try and go and get us on, keep us on track. I was asked to talk a little bit about not only just college student substance use, but particularly as someone that does wear more than 1 hat, what types of issues those working with students are facing. And I realize that I have colleagues in this room that either work in prevention, in wellness, in education, in the counseling centers or health centers. And so a lot of people certainly are very aware of some of the kind of frontline things that come up, but I do want to, as best as I can, show you what the data also suggest. So over the course of this morning, I'll go over what the research shows on substance use, some of the research on mental health. When we look at what we're facing on college campuses, certainly there's been everything from more subjective reports and impressions around mental health to seeing that there's even data supporting what's going on. Students' access of services, considering prevention and intervention approaches, emerging issues and challenges to consider, and then implications for those of us on college campuses. My thanks to John Schulenberg, who you'll be hearing later in this conference. John knows because I've told him before, everybody has that person that they think is their favorite speaker. John is mine. John is one of the researchers on the Monitoring the Future study, and I asked if it would be okay to show a couple of their slides from their project. Alcohol has never stopped being the primary drug of choice on college campuses. When we look at what the research shows, from their most recent study of the Monitoring the Future report, 82% of college students say that they've consumed alcohol in the past year. What can we conclude even from that? Obviously, 82% of students aren't over the age of 21, so we do have some underage students who make the choice to drink. But also noteworthy is that about 1 in 5 don't drink. So it's important for us when we're considering prevention, when we're considering intervention, to keep in mind, how do we keep those who make the choice to abstain, how do we keep them abstaining and make sure those students know they're not alone? 2/3 report that they've been drunk in the past year. When you look just at past months, 69% report any alcohol use, 45% report having been drunk. So it's not a stretch to say if you ask in the past month, particularly if you look at this statistic, most students either don't drink at all, or if they do, drink in a way that doesn't involve getting intoxicated. Just as a side note, too, to clarify, I tried to make my slides look a lot prettier than I've made them look in the past, and so I was particularly happy with how this one turned out. But I do want to clarify. So this is a fifth, and this is Beethoven's fifth. So that was really funny at 4 in the morning to me. All right, so when we ask students about their drinking, also will result in a different answer. Among studies, I always like to remind myself of, Frandale Boca did work where she had diary studies over the course of an academic year to demonstrate when we ask students, tell us about what a typical week looked like in the past month. When you ask that, we'll get a very different answer. Ask that right around here, someone goes back a month, tells a different story than we ask it at a different time during the year. If you look on average over the course of an academic year, there are clearly periods that we know can be associated with high-risk events. Spring break, depending on where you are in your academic year, is either long gone or has more recently ended. But we know that that tends to be the highest drinking week in a college year. New Year's week, driven almost entirely by New Year's Eve. And then apparently students just have a lot to be thankful about because I love stuffing. And Thanksgiving winds up being a week where there's a lot of drinking going on too. One of the things that is probably one of my favorite studies to look at so often on our campus is we say, what are we going to do with our freshmen? Great question, appropriate question, and certainly a legitimate question. But the key is that there's certainly more work that, of course, can be done across freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. John Schulenberg and Jennifer Maggs looked at trajectories of binge drinking. And while certainly there are various definitions of that, if we simply look at having 5 or more drinks at least once in the past 2 weeks, if all you do is look at the overall data, we've got under half that never have more than 4. So not reflected on this chart are the 44% who simply don't ever do this. If all you do is look at the average, it's this bold black line across the center, where we would say, at best, about once in the past 2 weeks, students say they've had a binge drinking episode. But that clearly doesn't tell the whole story. If we look at the different trajectories, you've got 17% of students who do this rarely, and they stay that way throughout college. There can be a tendency to say, okay, good, these are the low-risk students. But if they're doing it rarely, when they do it, it could be an episode where there could certainly be some consequences associated with that. You've got 7% along the top who do this frequently. If you look at the y-axis, this is happening once, twice, 3 to 5 times. Do it frequently, and they stay that way all 4 years of school. Obviously, if they make it to their senior year from a retention standpoint, there can be some consequences that these students experience too. But what's interesting are the trends that change. 12% of students decrease. They come in looking like the chronic folks, and by the time they're seniors, match the frequency of the rare. And 2 groups we've been spending a lot of time talking about are the increase. 10% come in looking like the rare, but by the time they're seniors, match the frequency of the chronic drinkers. And maybe I just like that there's someone who I really respect research-wise that named one of the trajectories a fling, but there are 10% of students that have a fling with alcohol. They come in, not really drinking, and then they meet alcohol, and they're like, I love you, alcohol. And they spend time with alcohol, and then alcohol does something that upsets them, and they're like breaking up with you. And by the time they're seniors, now they're reaching the folks that are in the rare trajectory. John actually presented this in our state at a regional conference of NASPA, where I remember he talked about that as a field, we can do a great job back here looking and telling the story of a student's 4 years in college. But it's harder when we're here to project what trajectory are these students going to go on. So while it's easy to say, let's work with the freshmen that are particularly high risk, it's important to realize that beyond a student's freshman year, there can certainly be work to be done as well. When you look at consequences related to alcohol use, the National College Health Assessment from the American College Health Association, or the easy to say ACHA-NCHA, is a survey that you can actually download at that same website, acha-ncha.org. Their referent group, they exclude schools that just had people fill out surveys as they came into a building or where they didn't use different recruitment strategies that met criteria for their inclusion in the referent group. They've got a sample of 34,000 students from 57 colleges or universities. When we look at consequences that students experience, this is from the start of this academic year. It's just published. Within the past 30 days, 15% of students report that they drove after drinking any alcohol at all. Of actually driving after 5 or more drinks, 2% said that they'd done this. When we look at consequences students experience, it's interesting because there are consequences that a lot of students, or at least certainly larger percentages, endorsed, and then some that's smaller, but certainly the severity of these, when you consider it across 34,000, are pretty striking. In the past 12 months, 22% did something they later regretted. 1 in 5 forgot where they were or what they did. 10.8% had unprotected sex. 10.7% physically injured themselves. If you look at the ones with smaller endorsement, getting in trouble with the police, physically injuring another person, 1.5%, because of their drinking, had sex with someone without giving your consent. And to go out of order, 0.3% actually said, I had sex with someone and never got their consent. When we look at sexual assault and relationship violence prevention, it's sad to see numbers like this that certainly can, when you bring that to scale. 1.2% because of drinking, a way the question was worded, seriously considered suicide. Other substances are certainly being used. 35% of college students say they've used an illicit drug in the past year. If you only ask about marijuana, 32% say they smoked pot in the past year. Dump marijuana from the equation, 15% report past year use of any other illicit drug. I like to point out that this plus this doesn't equal the 35. So in that 35% are students that make the choice to use marijuana and use something else. And of course, alcohol could certainly be something else thrown in the mix there. What's noteworthy is that more students reported use of marijuana in the past year, 32%, than did tobacco cigarettes, 30%, in the most recent year of this study. What's interesting is that certainly there can be regional differences, and you might have substances that are making their way on your campus. But being certainly aware of the rates and being aware of what students are using can be important. I think I have time to tell. One of the reasons that I love doing work with college students is I don't know, I have lots of reasons, but I love the opportunity certainly to impact student health and well-being, but some of the stories that come from work with students are, I wouldn't have believed them if they hadn't actually happened. I was doing work in a sanction group with mandated students where I told them, if you have questions about the drugs, go ahead and let me know. And one of the students raised his hand and he said, what happens if you combine alcohol and marzipan? And I said, excuse me? And he said, what happens if you combine alcohol and marzipan? And I said, marzipan? And he said, I thought you were supposed to be the drug expert. And I was like, I am. But I was like, well, okay, well, pretending that that's the label you want to call me. Marzipan is the delicious almond paste that they shape into delightful little fruits. And I was like, dude, did you mean lorazepam? And he goes, oh, man. And he's like, yeah, I may have, my street credibility may have taken a bit of a shot. Because he's like, no lie, I was trying to get marzipan at a party on the weekend. I was like, well, I hope you got the little strawberries, because those are pretty. All right. Possibly a good transition into mental health. Health issues are clearly impacting academic success, and these are not necessarily even new studies. 92% of depressed students show signs of academic impairment. Recognizing that we do work in college settings, that impact can be very striking. 70% of students seeking counseling say that personal problems affected their academics. When you asked in the, I'm very aware of the fact that I'm standing right in front of the slide, so I keep moving. ACHA, out of 31 categories, point-blank asked students, have these affected your academic success in the past year? So these are, of course, students self-report. But when you ask students what gets in the way of your academic success, stress, number one thing. Sleep difficulties. 1 in 5 say sleep difficulties. Health and well-being, cold, flu, or sore throat. Anxiety, work. Internet use or computing games. Depression, and then concern for a troubled friend or family member. When we look at, from a diagnostic standpoint, as we know, there's a distinction between being, feeling down or depressed and actually having depression. Study by Blanco and colleagues, looking at large samples of both college and non-college young adults, found that almost half, 45.8% of college students met past year prevalence of an Axis I psychiatric disorder, personality disorder, or substance use disorder. And you can see the percentages here of past year. This matches very closely. SAMHSA's data shows 20.5%, so from an inter-reader reliability standpoint, it's looking very close. 18% personality disorder, 12% anxiety disorder, and 11% mood disorder. Asking students in the past month, what things have you experienced? Almost 70% said that they were overwhelmed by all that they had to do. 30% have felt overwhelming anxiety. 20% have felt overwhelming anger. Of course, overwhelming is in the eye of the student rating the survey, but certainly, and this is not in your life, this is not in the past year, this is truly in the past month. 65.8% felt exhausted and not from anything they'd done physically. 37.8% very sad. 36% very lonely. About a quarter feeling things were hopeless. I mean, when we look at the impact that can have, that's sad to even see as a statistic. And about 1 in 6 felt so depressed that it was difficult to function. This was not a matter of ACHA being dramatic at all in their wording. They literally said, in the past year, what of these have been traumatic for you? And if not traumatic, very difficult to handle. If you look at the top 5 academics, you know, a lot of people's impression is school's getting very, very competitive, and students are telling us that. Finances and financial stress, 30% intimate relationships, 27% family problems, and there's our friend sleep again, with about a quarter of students saying that that's been very difficult to handle. We know these things don't occur in a vacuum. If you look from a comorbidity standpoint, you've got 17% of students saying they've been diagnosed by a professional with depression at some time in their life, with big differences between men and women. However, what have we known for at least the last 15, 20 years? A diagnosis of depression includes increased risk for co-occurring anxiety issues, substance abuse issues, and some work Virginia Ross has done highlights that the co-occurrence of depression and alcohol and other drug use increases the risk of suicide. When you look at students' access to services, I mean, these are the data that if we can come up with some ideas here, I think we're doing our students a huge service. Danny Eisenberg at the University of Michigan used the Patient Health Questionnaire 9, the PHQ-9, to screen for depression and found students that met criteria for being at risk for depression. Of those, 72% who screened positive felt like they needed help. Here's the crazy part. Of all those that said they felt they needed help, only about a third had received services of any kind. 2/3 of the students that are flagging, not just saying, I feel down, flagging for depression, and are even saying, I think I need help, aren't getting it. Because the data they collected, they were able to look at what was associated with not getting help. The factors related to access, it kills me when I meet a senior who goes, we have a counseling center, and it's like, wow, that's a fixable concern. But one of the factors related to access were students not aware of or familiar with service options. Questioning the helpfulness, what are they really going to do? Like I've seen Dr. Phil. They're concerned about, will therapy be helpful, will medication be helpful, uncertain about what could be covered insurance-wise. Less use by students who reported growing up in their own words, a poor family. And the authors hypothesized that even though we have centers that will make their care free, asking for help may be more than what the price tag associated with that symbolizes and means. And finally, less use by those identifying as Asian or Pacific Islander. When you actually ask the students themselves, how come you haven't gotten help? The perception that, like, other students need it more. Do I really need this? And stress is normal, right? If I ask for therapy, aren't I going to be taking away services from the students that really need it? And finally, the perception that if they went to counseling, it would take a long, long time. This is related to this conference. There's the 20.6% that meet past year prevalence of an alcohol use disorder. This is from Wu and colleagues using the SAMHSA data set. Very different story, though, than when we look at alcohol use. Only 3.9% of full-time college students with an alcohol use disorder received alcohol services in the past year. This is not a matter, though, of students beating down the door to get in for services. Only 2.4% of those who screened positive and did not receive services perceived a need for services. You'll be hearing later today from Scott Walters and Mary Larimer about brief interventions where we'll talk about the idea of trying to prompt contemplation and change in people who may not see that. And clearly, that type of work is both indicated and needed. Finally, when we consider what we do, it's important to keep in mind that any one thing we do is a piece of an overall puzzle. You're going to be hearing from Bob Saltz and others about community and environmental approaches. You're going to be hearing certainly about more individual targeted approaches. But keep in mind that what we do, there's going to be a different audience. This is something adapted from the Institute of Medicine. Along the top are consequences associated with a person's use. Along the bottom are the strategies we could use in response to that. What often gets lost in the shuffle is that the bulk of our students are over here, right? The bulk of our students either don't drink, or if they do, have no to mild consequences associated with their use. Why does that get lost in the shuffle? Because the local paper doesn't say, nothing happened at our university this weekend. Instead, we hear about the extreme stuff, and it paints the picture that that's what, quote, everybody does, right? In response to this, you could do population level, universal prevention. Classically, what we would look at also certainly is primary prevention, where the goal is to delay the onset of use in abstainers, keep abstainers abstaining, or have whatever use is out there, keep that from developing any further. Quick side story about primary prevention. More classic primary prevention you would certainly see done in elementary schools and middle schools. And Clayton Neighbors, who's now at the University of Houston, and I had the chance to present at a school district in the Puget Sound area, where when we put up this slide, this guy raises his hand, he goes, I've been cursed by primary prevention. Like, that's kind of a weird thing to be cursed by, right? It's like vampires, I get that. But it's like the primary prevention part, that seems weird. And he said, no, seriously, everything I've ever done has backfired. I wouldn't have believed this guy if he hadn't brought us the box of proof. He was asked by his superintendent, get a prevention message in the hand of every kid in the elementary schools. And see, he ordered thousands of pencils that all said, friends don't let friends do drugs. And the little kids were like, yay. And they used the pencils, and they sharpened the pencils, and they wound up with little pencils that said, friends do drugs. So the guy was like, wow, seriously? That's not cool. So we're going to need to get those pencils back. And then they ordered mechanical pencils, and like little first graders were like, can't use. And so they wound up wasting a lot of money. But I digress. Far side, moderate to severe problems associated with use. These are the students for whom specialized treatment might be indicated. Again, you'll be hearing later today about the students who maybe have made the choice to drink and where interventions might fit in. But again, please keep in mind, there's so many good things you're going to be hearing about, and it's not a matter of do we do this one or this one. Oftentimes it can be we do them both because they may have a different population in mind. When we look at emerging issues, there are two different surveys of counseling center directors, one with more of a global feel, one that looks at more with U.S. Counseling centers. Bob Gallagher's work out of the University of Pittsburgh, Victor Barr from the University of Tennessee. And of course, these are just people's impression, yet both. 94% of counseling center directors perceived a growing concern or a significant increase in students with more severe psychological problems. Both of those, again, same percentage, even though it was worded ever so slightly differently. Despite that, 2/3 of counseling centers in our country have either stayed the same size or actually lost staff positions. Over the past 5 years, the percentage of directors noting increases in the following. 3/4 say we've seen an increase in students with psychiatric medication issues, 70% crisis issues requiring an immediate response, 58% learning disabilities, 56% self-injury issues, and just under half illicit drug use and alcohol abuse. Two things I'll say about the medication and self-injury. There's some reason to suggest that's not just an impression. Alan Schwartz, when the American College Health Association turned 100 years old, did a comparative analysis of the percentage of college counseling clients already taking medication, and here's what he found. If you look from the early 90s, we've seen a 5-fold increase, and realize that this ended in 2003. We've seen a 5-fold increase in the number of students already taking medication. Certainly, somewhere in there is everything from if they make the choice to use substances, how's that impacting from a drug interaction standpoint, what they're doing, plus other issues that might be going on. As far as self-harm goes, asking in the past year from ACHA and NCHA, 6% have seriously considered suicide, 5% have intentionally cut, burned, bruised, or otherwise injured themselves, 1.3% have attempted suicide. These numbers get smaller if you ask for past months, but certainly remain an issue. A study published earlier this year in Psychology of Addictive Behaviors looked at factors related to self-injury. They did a large sample that included both undergraduate and graduate students and found that in the past year, 14% of students reported that they'd hurt themselves without the intent of killing themselves. And they had a number of different criteria associated with what counted as self-injurious behavior. Among undergrads only, it was 15.8% that reported past year self-injury behavior. Of those that had injury behavior, 1 in 5, it played itself out through cutting. When they looked at factors associated with higher rates of self-injury, drug use was associated with higher rates of all forms of self-injury, and it was a number of different forms presented. The highest rates of self-injury behavior were grad students. If it was a grad student who smoked tobacco and used illicit drugs, 62% of those students said that they had, in the past year, injured themselves without the intent of ending their life. When they used regression analyses to take a look at what was associated with predicting this, the factors associated with increased odds included drug use, cigarette smoking, gambling, depression, sexual orientation, students that identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, you saw higher rates, and undergraduate student status versus grad student status. Past 2-week binge drinking, on its own, didn't significantly predict. Frequent binge drinking, however, was associated with higher rates. The authors suggested that if what a college is trying to target is actually self-injury, that perhaps targeting frequent binge drinking and those using other drugs rather than necessarily all college students might buy a lot more bang for our buck if that's what we're looking at. I've gone fast enough. I'm going to magically, hopefully, end up right with the 25 minutes I was given. The data show not much evidence that severity actually is increasing. And there's been a few reasons hypothesized why. It might be that there is no general trend, but centers might be seeing clients with more complex problems or multiple diagnoses. And there is data to back that up. A small rise in extremely distressed students. Sherry Benton's work showing that students highly stressful managed have tripled. consistent increased service demand coupled with loss of staff positions, or that some individual campuses might actually have this problem. Joe Califano's group at Columbia has suggested that the great availability of medication could allow students to attend college who otherwise might not have done so, and a recent study suggested that might be the case, that youth access of effective treatments during adolescence may help students function at a level that now allows college attendance, when in the past that may not have been happening. Also, lesser stigma attached to mental illness may have led to an increase in students seeking help, and Hunt and Eisenberg suggested the same. I love this quote. I think any of the people in this room would be proud to have written this quote. The solution lies in being aware of these health issues, intervening earlier, and providing support with adequate and appropriate services. What's so striking about this quote is it didn't come from anywhere in North America. This comes from a couple of faculty at a university in Turkey. And I think what's so eye-opening about that this is not just a US, a Canada, this is certainly from a global standpoint. We have a lot to learn from each other in the spirit of not reinventing the wheel. One of the things that could take place is early identification of students and coordination of care. 2/3 of counseling centers, no relationship with the health center. When you look at routine screening, only 1/3 of health centers routinely screen for alcohol problems. Only 1 in 6 of these use standardized instruments when they do. But we can make a difference with more standardized screening. In Gallagher's study, of 103 suicides reported by college counseling center directors, 19% were former or current clients. 81% had never been known to the counseling center. Michael Klein and Henry Chung at New York University work as part of the College Depression Partnership. I come into the health center, my thumb hurts, fill out a depression screening. I've got a cold, fill out a depression screening. Screening over 58,000 students in health centers at 8 schools, they identified 801 students who otherwise would have slipped through the cracks and did not identify as asking for help with their depression. What's cool about that is over 35% of the students that they identified, self-identified as racial or ethnic minority students who typically would have either underutilized or been underserved in a health and counseling context. They found they were able to improve clinical outcomes for at-risk, underserved students through that early detection and coordinated proactive follow-up. In this room, you'll be hearing later from Matt Martins, who, when he was at Albany, also did the same type of thing using the audit and referral to basics in the waiting room of their health and counseling center. Students that had no reason to have come in for their substance use, that were screened and offered, students that got basics, a brief alcohol screening and intervention for college students, had decreased alcohol use, correct norm misperception, and increased use of protective behaviors. When looking at what to do, considering outreach, education campaigns, or initiatives to address things like not knowing about what's available, potential effectiveness, but also pay attention to other issues that might impede access to service, if there are attitude concerns, this type of thing. And Eisenberg and colleagues pointed out this can only be successful if resources are prepared to support demand for services. My final piece of data before I wrap up is that counseling, I worked in a counseling center for a decade, and I applaud the work that people do in the counseling centers on our campuses. And as you can see, 2/3 either stayed the same or actually lost staff. Counseling can impact retention. Turner and Berry showed that retention rates were higher, 11% higher for students that got counseling versus those who did not. The key is being able to ask for counseling and get it pays a big difference. Wilson, Mason, and Ewing followed students who requested counseling and intentionally excluded those who asked about retention-related concerns. 79% of students that asked for counseling and got it were retained. They defined retained as still being enrolled or graduated 2 years later. Of those that asked for services but wound up on a waiting list, never wound up having that first session for whatever reason, only 65% of those were retained. Take that 14% retention advantage, translate that in tuition and fees, and it's not a matter of can we afford to hire more people, it could even be a matter of can we afford not to. As I look at my kind of wrap up here, doing what we can to meet students' interests is a possible foot in the door. In ACHA's most recent study, 61% of students said that they'd received information on alcohol and other drug use from their college or university. According to the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act, that should be 100%. So I don't know if students are not what they're counting as received information. But when you ask them, what are you interested in getting? 28% say, well, I'd like information on alcohol and other drug use. So when you hear about, from Scott and Mary later today about brief interventions, we'll talk about finding the hook. What will make a student say, ooh, I'm interested in learning more about that, particularly if their substance use could be related to it. 63% want interest in stress reduction. Imagine the way to include ways that you could give that information, but highlight how alcohol use could be contributing to or exacerbating some of the issues around stress. 60% want information on nutrition. For years, many brief interventions have translated drinks per week into caloric content. Half want information on sleep difficulties. Talk about how alcohol affects REM deprivation and subsequent increases in things like anxiety. and 52% want information on how to help others in distress. Considering where students get or could get their health information, 2/3 of students say, my faculty or coursework is a believable source of health information. Faculty and coursework are in 3rd place behind health educators and health center medical staff. When you ask students, where do you get your health information? Faculty and coursework is in 10th place. In your own state, there's a lot of this work being done. Lauren Martin at Elon University has done work actually training faculty to deliver brief interventions, to take a look at what impact those folks can actually have. Where do students get their information? 1st place, internet. When you ask students, do you believe it? Only 1/4 of students see the web as a believable source of information. 9th place out of 14 categories. So perhaps evaluating the variability and believability of websites that we might link to. And finally, parents certainly have a place, and there's work we can do with them. Parents, where they get it, 2nd place behind the internet. The difference is 4th place in terms of most believable. Considering strategies to address overlap of mental health issues and substance use. Again, early identification through screening and outreach. In health and wellness, where I work, we reach out to students that we know are on our radar for a range of different health or addictive behaviors related issues. Considering the approaches as part of an overall strategic plan. It's, again, not just the individually focused or the environment, but a strategic plan that includes both. Reducing barriers to implementation and access, not only to services, but to evidence-based approaches. I love that we have a room full of people, many of whom are doing research and or doing the actual applied work on campus, but building bridges between the researchers and practitioners. We have a lot to learn from each other as someone who gets to keep a foot in both realms, and I think that that's great that everyone's in the same room for this. And finally, be patient. There are no easy answers, often we want them. I'm married to a school teacher, and that gives me access to some very sweet answers on tests. Hard water is, of course, waters with high level of calcium and magnesium, but according to this student, the easy answer, briefly explain what hard water is. Nice. There we go. I magically hit exactly my time. I put my email address up there. I know my slides will be available. Thank you to Erica for organizing this. Helene White is not only a great colleague, but along with her husband Larry, has been a dear friend, and I appreciate the invitation very much to do this. Thank you to John for allowing me to use the trajectory stuff, and I will hope you all have a very successful conference. Thank you very much.